the keto diet is the only diet that you can prick your finger and prove that you're actually doing the diet right or wrong. Like if you're in ketosis, you're definitely doing it right. And if you're not in ketosis, there's something there that needs to be addressed, whether too much protein or too high of carbohydrates or whatever it is. But I think it's really important in the beginning. Now, some people get hung up on numbers. Some people get addicted to higher ketone numbers, thinking the higher the better, when in reality, that's not necessarily true.
Welcome to the Gene Food Podcast. I'm your host, John O'Connor. Hey everybody, welcome to the show. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to give a little plug for a new product that we are creating at Gene Food that is very relevant to today's episode. We're doing an app called Ketoscore. So there is a gene called PPARA, which determines whether people can achieve nutritional ketosis. Because we all know that when you go on the ketogenic diet journey, you're looking for those ketone levels being elevated in the blood, and those are what are protective. And as it turns out, there's a genetic dividing line between us, fairly common polymorphisms in PPARA. And we're putting together a tool that's going to tell you, A, can you achieve a state of nutritional ketosis? And B, is a high-fat, saturated fat diet going to do something good to your body, or do we predict that you might want to go into more of a direction of monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, or maybe just avoid ketogenic diets altogether? Our guest today is a follower of the ketogenic diet, but one of the reasons why we love him is because he recognizes that there's a great deal of bioindividuality out there and that the ketogenic diet is not suited to everybody. However, it's certainly suited to him. Drew Manning, Fit to Fat to Fit, one of the smartest and best commentators on the ketogenic diet. Drew just completed a race where he ran 100 miles in 24 hours for charity, which is very impressive. And he has a lot of really cool things to say about empathy in the health and wellness space, about raising kids on social media, about body image, about how he approaches keto and what his macros are and how he eats and how he measures and how he tests. Really impressive guy. We were very excited to have him on. So without further ado, here is Drew Manning from Fit to Fat to Fit on the Gene Food Podcast. So we have Drew Manning here from Fit to Fat to Fit, joining us from Utah. I was on Drew's show a few weeks back, and he has an awesome story, so I kind of had to have him on the Gene Food Podcast as well. So Drew, thanks for joining, man. How are you this morning?
Doing great. Thanks, John, for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I was really happy to get you in front of our audience because you have such a cool story. You got to be one of my favorite people in the keto community, which we're going to get into in a minute. But I think for the people that haven't had exposure to you or heard of your story before, can you just tell us, how did you get the name of your business, Fit to Fat to Fit?
So that name I actually came up with that idea back in 2011. So I had this crazy idea. I was a personal trainer at the time. I had never been overweight a day in my life at the time. And here I was trying to help people who were overweight most of their lives. And I could tell there was a disconnect. I couldn't understand why it was so hard for my clients just to do what I told them to do, like their meal plans, their workouts, like they would struggle. And I'm like, why is this so hard? You just put down the junk food, you go to the gym, it's not that hard. Like, why is it so hard? And they would tell me, Drew, you don't really understand what it's like because for you, you've always been fit. And I kind of took that to heart. So I was thinking of ideas. Okay, how can I gain a better understanding of what it's like to be overweight? And this idea of getting fat on purpose, as crazy as that sounds, it popped up in my head and it just made sense. It felt like it was a calling to me. And so I was thinking of ideas or names I could call this journey. Like, what would I call this, And the Fit to Fat to Fit kind of had a ring to it. And I tested out with friends and family. Like, what do you think about Fit to Fat to Fit? Like, that makes perfect sense. So that's where the name came from. And that was my journey of gaining weight for 6 months. So I stopped exercising for 6 months, put on 75 pounds, which was way more than I thought I would gain. And then I had to lose the weight. I had to walk the walk and put my money where my mouth is and show people, okay, this is how you lose the weight in the next 6 months. So it was a year-long journey. The story went viral. Wrote a book about it, had a TV show about it, went on a bunch of TV shows as well. And that's where most people know me as the Fit to Fat to Fit guy.
Yeah. And you went on Leno for that, didn't you?
Yeah. Jay Leno was the first TV show I went on. He had me on, and it was very entertaining, very fun. I was sitting next to Chelsea Handler, and that was an interesting experience.
Dude, what was that like backstage? I mean, I would have been terrified to go on Leno. I would have been like, oh my God, that's such an intense platform.
It was intense because you're in front of a live audience, even though it's taped earlier in the day, right? They release it that night, and you're next to a celebrity like Chelsea Handler. I was super nervous, but I compared it to sports, wrestling, football. Once like that first whistle blows and you start, like you kind of tap into a different part of your brain. That's what I felt like on Jay Leno. I was like, all right, I'm in the zone. I'm not worrying about what to say or what not to say, and I just kind of let it flow naturally. And I kind of compare that to, or I attribute doing okay on the show. I thought I did really good from my sports background, and so that's what it was like. So it was fun. Jay Leno was a really nice guy.
Yeah. I had a previous startup, failed startup that I worked on where we did Shark Tank. So I have some I don't think it's quite as intense as Leno, but you kind of get out there and I know what you mean. You're kind of nervous to begin and then you start going and you're like, whatever. And we were taking heavy fire too. So, yeah, that can be really intense. So in terms of, the protocol for putting on 75 pounds, like, because right now you're keto. I mean, you're strict, like measuring ketones, like fat adapted athlete, ripped, going to the gym. What were your go-to foods for putting on that kind of weight?
So I wanted to focus on everyday American foods that a lot of us grew up with in the 70s and 80s. Because I remember watching Morgan Spurlock on Super Size Me, and he focused heavily on fast food, specifically McDonald's. And I think most Americans know fast food is super unhealthy, and you'll gain a lot of weight eating only fast food. What I wanted to do was focus on these everyday American foods that we grew up with in the 70s and 80s that sometimes we don't think is that bad for us. So things like white bread, white pasta, juices, granola bars, chips, cookies, crackers, SpaghettiOs, Hot Pockets, Top Ramen, mac and cheese, all these foods that are super affordable and cheap. That's the thing. They're so affordable and they're so cheap, but they're also convenient because all you have to do is either warm it up in the microwave or add some milk to it and you have a meal. And they taste really, really good. I'm not going to lie. The hyper palatability of these foods is like nothing you can find in nature. And so we become so addicted so quickly to these foods. It's incredible. And even for me, I found myself getting addicted to these foods. But those are the types of foods I wanted to focus on because I feel like 80% of America, they buy these foods because they've been marketed to us since we were kids. I remember seeing commercials in the 80s as a kid, a complete American breakfast, which was a bowl of cereal, a tall glass of juice, and a piece of toast. Like that's what we've been ingrained and programmed to think, oh, well, that's what we eat for breakfast here in America. So that's what we eat. And that's what I ate was that food probably 90% of the time.
Yeah. And did you get any, because I know Morgan Spurlock, I love that movie, Super Size Me. I've seen that movie like 100 times. Some of the most compelling scenes in that movie are when he goes in and talks to his physicians and they're like, dude, if you keep doing this, you're going to like drop dead tomorrow. Yeah. Did you do any blood work during that time to see what your cholesterol looked like or what your blood sugar numbers looked like or any of that?
Yes, I did. About every month I would draw blood work with my doctor, and I can't remember the specific numbers of everything. I do remember a couple of specifics. Obviously, everything was in the red as far as health goes, health markers go, triglycerides, HDL, LDL, all your basic lipids. But then I remember my blood pressure got up to 167 over 113. Oh, God. And my testosterone, actually, we measured that, was in the low 200s, which is very low for a 31-year-old male that was as healthy as I was. But then eating this way totally dropped it, which was not fun to have low testosterone. So I wish I had the other numbers memorized, but, I got up to 32% body fat and 269 at my heaviest.
Wow. And how did people... people that are listening to the show should definitely follow you on Instagram. We're going to get into some of the cool messaging that you have. We really admire your message and your brand, which is why I want to have you on. But you're clearly somebody who's a trainer. You said at the beginning of the show, you're used to being in good shape. It's kind of, I think I know from your bio and chatting with you previously that you played college sports. Mm-hmm. So how did you notice the world changing and how they reacted to you, like when you'd go into a room or you'd go socially, did you start to feel like you were a different person in terms of like, you know, I don't know, attention from women, like social respect? Like, how did that change when you put on all this weight? If
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a good question, because that was the biggest challenge for me was the mental and emotional journey that I was on, being overweight, because physically I was prepared for that side of it. Mentally, emotionally, it was really what I struggled with. So here's the thing: when you grow up your entire life in shape, like I did, most people, their identity becomes their body. And the opposite of that is true too. People who grow up their entire life overweight associate their self-image with their body image. And that was for sure me. And that's why I freaked out going out in public, because I was so uncomfortable being overweight for the first time, because it's a loss of identity. So I wanted to go up to strangers and tell them, like, hey, I'm not really overweight. This is just an experiment. Here's my before picture. Like, this is the real me. This is not who I really am. Just want to let you know what's going on, because I was so uncomfortable. And it was difficult for me. Now, here's the thing. No one treated me differently, I would say, because I feel like society doesn't judge men as much for being hefty or bigger, right? I think women have it harder. I feel like they're judged more harshly in public if they don't look a certain way. But men, I don't really remember anyone being rude to me or saying anything rude to me. But I do remember this. I remember one time I was in the grocery store checking out with my shopping cart full of junk food, right? And then there were these three women behind me. And I was overweight at the time, of course. And I remember checking out with all this junk food and cereal and soda and, you know, all kinds of stuff. And I just remember looking at them, kind of noticing them looking at me, looking at the food, and like I felt judgment. Whether they were judging me or not, I don't really know. I just was so uncomfortable in that moment where I wanted to just say, hey ladies, I normally eat spinach and broccoli and kale. Like I normally am healthy, but this is just an experiment I'm doing. And I kind of bit my tongue and I didn't say anything in that moment, because I wanted that feeling to sink in, because it was in that moment where it clicked for me, man, this is what my clients go through on a daily basis. Yeah. They're probably feeling that judgment everywhere they go because they're overweight, because people might be looking at them differently. And whether people are judging you or not, you don't really know, but you feel the judgment. And I felt that for the first time. And that's where I started to empathize with my clients. Like, man, I see how hard this is, you know, and I see like how hard it is in society to be overweight, because, and I didn't grow up overweight. So I'm not trying to pretend I know exactly what it's like. This is just give me a small taste of what some people have to go through. And it was really intense, and it was really hard for me. So I do remember that, and that was a huge lesson I learned was how much of this journey was mental and emotional more so than physical.
Yeah, and then of course, so I mean, you've got the fat is the kind of the sandwich in between the two fits in your brand. So of course, we know you came back to fit, and one of the things that I think is interesting about how you approach your current sort of eating philosophy is you push a lot of content out about, hey, this is how I eat. You have your keto school teaching people how to do low carb lifestyle, but you're also open to other schools of eating and realizing that people are unique in terms of what works for them. So how did you come to keto? How did you find out conclusively that worked for you? Did you start low carb, then go keto? I want to kind of get your wisdom on the ketogenic diet here and how you decided to go for it.
So a lot of people think I did keto because they know me as the keto guy now. But back then in 2011, keto wasn't very mainstream. Not a lot of people were talking about it. It wasn't very well known. And the internet and social media isn't what it is today back then, or wasn't what it is today. So I did more of a paleo-ish approach to lose the weight, which worked fine, right? It worked great for me to lose the weight that way. I stumbled upon keto about 5 years ago, listening to a podcast with Tim Ferriss, and he was interviewing Dr. Dominic D'Agostino. And I remember hearing about the ketogenic diet from a different perspective on the podcast. It wasn't about weight loss. It wasn't about fat loss necessarily. It was about the therapeutic applications to the ketogenic diet. So things like epilepsy, traumatic brain injury, brain toxicity, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, all these studies that have been done on the ketogenic diet for these diseases. And I had no idea that kind of research was being done on a diet. And so I was like, man, this is very intriguing to me. And if Tim Ferriss is interested in it, maybe it's something I could look into. So I decided to experiment with it, did my own 60-day experiment. And the thing that I loved about it was the improvement in mental clarity. For me, it was like night and day, the way my brain functioned being in a ketogenic state plus not being a slave to food anymore. So I was used to eating 6 meals a day, every few hours, and it worked for me as far as like physique goes. Yes, you can still look good that way, but now I could eat twice a day or sometimes once a day and still feel satiated. My brain felt so much sharper, and my digestion was way better because I wasn't eating all day long. And so that's what I loved about the ketogenic diet. And then I fell in love with it, started to study it more, got to meet Dr. Dom. And then from there, through him, was able to go on the Dr. Oz show to teach people about the ketogenic diet. And that's where I started to do more research and teaching more people about it, because people wanted to ask me, how do you do it? And then that's what led me to my second book, Complete Keto, which is my approach to keto, which kind of incorporates the mental and emotional lessons I learned from Fit to Fat to Fit, plugging that into a ketogenic diet that's based on whole foods. It's all dairy-free and nut-free recipes in the book, because I feel like those are the two problem areas that people tend to gravitate towards when they go keto, because those are cheap, easy foods that we overconsume sometimes on keto, just because they're low carb or they're keto friendly. So anyways, that's kind of my approach to keto in a nutshell, is the mental and emotional side plus the dairy-free, nut-free, whole food approach to keto.
So when you got started then, did you find for you that nuts and dairy were something that you were relying on because you thought, okay, I'm a beginner on keto. I know I need to get fat. I know I need to stay in ketosis. And what you basically, sounds like you might have done too much almond butter, too much peanut butter, and then you course corrected and went in what direction instead? Like, what are your staple foods on keto right now?
Yeah, so I think everyone, when they go keto, especially back in the day, there wasn't as many resources back then of how to do keto. There weren't programs, like there's nowadays, everyone has a keto program, right? Back then, there wasn't a lot of information. And so, it was a lot of dairy because like you're kind of learning what to eat. Okay, cut out carbs. All right, what food doesn't have carbs? Nut butters, nuts and seeds, and dairy are easy snack type foods. And so, but then over the years, I kind of learned more about, more of a whole foods approach. And yes, I felt good still being in a ketogenic state, but I felt like I felt better once I cut some of those foods out, for the most part, not forever, just every once in a while. So I wasn't eating so much of those foods, which can be inflammatory for some people if they overconsume them. And so nowadays, it's definitely more of a whole foods approach. I wouldn't say it's 100% dairy free. I do a little bit of whey protein just in this phase that I'm in now, because I just finished a 100-mile race a month ago or so, and now I'm trying to put on some size. So I'm doing a little bit of whey protein. But for the most part, I try and avoid dairy, and I feel really good on it. And then it is mostly a whole foods approach. I started adding organ meats to the meat that I consume. I feel great on that, and it's a lot of meat and vegetables for me personally. But I cycle through my vegetables. I cycle through my protein sources and my fat sources, so I'm not always eating the same foods over and over again.
Yeah, so let's talk protein, because I know a lot of people that are big advocates of keto will warn you that proteins can kick you out of ketosis just as quickly as eating, some white bread or some carbs. How much protein are you getting on your ketogenic diet?
That's a good question. So in the beginning, I was so afraid of protein because there was this, in the industry, it was fairly new, and there wasn't a lot of blood ketone testing going on at the time. But it's like, hey, gluconeogenesis is something that's legit, that can happen. So you got to keep your protein really low. So in the beginning, I was doing 80 grams of protein a day, which the interesting thing was I was still able to maintain my muscle mass and my strength and eating 80 grams of protein a day. But I feel like now that I've done more blood testing and it's becoming more well known that gluconeogenesis is very bio-individual as far as eating too much protein to the point where you're kicked out of ketosis. But I've done some carnivore experiments. I know some people have done carnivore that are eating mostly protein, 200 plus grams of protein a day, and still staying in ketosis. So it is very bio-individual. Someone that's, sedentary, that maybe doesn't exercise at all, there is a point where they would consume too much protein, which is probably less than me, who's working out a lot, lifting a lot of heavy weights, have a lot of muscle mass, where I could probably utilize that and not get knocked out of ketosis. So it's very individual, and this is why I'm such a huge proponent of people finding out what their carb threshold is and their protein threshold is by doing blood ketone testing on a daily basis before and after meals to see what their protein threshold is and their carb threshold is, because it's going to vary person to person. So if I say, hey, stay under 30 grams of carbohydrates per day to get into ketosis. Well, for someone like me, I could eat upwards of 70, 80 grams of carbs a day and be in ketosis, but someone that's maybe sedentary, that doesn't have a lot of muscle mass, their metabolism is a little bit slower, maybe they need to be less than 20 grams a day. It just depends on the person. And that's where it's very individual, and there has to be testing.
Yeah. And that's a great point, because I think a lot of people don't realize that. You talked about Dom D'Agostino, and I've heard previous podcasts and done a little bit of the reading from like Richard Veach at Harvard and some of these guys who are the pioneers of ketone research. But I think there's a kind of a disconnect in the public, because what is protective about the ketogenic diet are the ketones. And people who are going on a ketogenic diet without measuring to see if they're actually in a state of ketosis. How do you see that? I mean, do you see that as a danger zone, being in keto, being in a ketogenic diet without the corresponding ketone levels up?
Yeah, because I feel like you never really know if you're in ketosis. So I know so many people that have they say like, I do keto, I've done keto, just didn't lose any weight on it, or didn't really know, what I was doing wrong. And I feel like unless you know for sure what your ketone levels are, you never really know if you're doing the diet right. The keto diet is the only diet that you can prick your finger and prove that you're actually doing the diet right or wrong. Like if you're in ketosis, you're definitely doing it right. And if you're not in ketosis, there's something there that needs to be addressed, whether too much protein or too high of carbohydrates or whatever it is. But I think it's really important in the beginning. Now, some people get hung up on numbers. Some people get addicted to higher ketone numbers, thinking the higher the better, when in reality, that's not necessarily true. Anything above 0.5 on the blood ketone meter is nutritional ketosis. So whether that's 0.5, 1.5, 3.5, it doesn't really matter, as long as you're above that 0.5 threshold. But it is important to know if you're actually doing the diet right, to know if you're actually in a ketogenic state. But I would say maybe do it for the first 2 to 4 weeks, get some data, like, in the morning time, afternoon time, evening time, after certain meals. And then from there, I don't really measure all the time. So I take breaks for a couple months, unless I really want to do some experimenting.
Yeah. And what I want to get into is how you, as a fat adapted athlete, ran for 100 miles. Before we do, I have to ask, I asked about the kind of the Morgan Spurlock experiment. Do you have any interest in, or are you regularly testing your cholesterol levels and blood lipid levels on the ketogenic diet? You do hear anecdotally out there, and I think there's an emerging scientific realization that some people, when they go on a ketogenic diet that's more focused on monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, have a much better outcome in terms of their lipid numbers, as opposed to some people can go on a super saturated fat heavy ketogenic diet and not really even see that much of a bump in markers like their LDL cholesterol or their LDL particle number. What are your comfort zones, if to the extent you're measuring for those types of metrics?
Yeah, so there's a really good book that I read that really helped me understand cholesterol and our lipids in general. Not that anyone has a complete understanding, because I feel like it's still something that's being discovered of what really matters and what doesn't. The problem is we've simplified it to, okay, your bad cholesterol is high, therefore you need to lower that, otherwise you'll have a heart attack. It's so much more complex. It's not as simple as, okay, my cholesterol is elevated, therefore I'm probably going to die. I think there's a few different things that I look at now. The LDL number for me isn't that important. For me, it's the trend of my HDL, my good cholesterol, is that trending upwards, which if you are consuming, a good amount of fat, your HDL should rise, and you're exercising as well. And then your triglyceride number, is that number trending downwards? If your HDL is trending upwards and your triglycerides are trending downwards, then for me, I don't put a lot of value on the LDL number by itself. If my HDL to triglyceride ratio is in the good range or optimal range. And then the other thing you mentioned, LDL particle size, I feel like all the doctors and professionals I talk to in the field, they put more value on that than just your LDL number, right? And so there's a lot more to look at it. So when people come to me and say, hey, my LDL went up, or my total cholesterol went up on keto, that's probably true for some people, but a lot of people see a drop in cholesterol number. So it's very individual. But what I tell them too is, if you are concerned about your LDL numbers, a couple things you could do is cut out some saturated fat and eat more poly and monounsaturated fats. So your lipid numbers might look better for you if you really are concerned about that. So cut out dairy, cut out maybe a ton of red meat, and maybe consume more plant-based fats like avocados and olives to get in those poly and monounsaturated fats and see if that improves your numbers to where you want them to be, but also go off of how you feel too. But that's kind of my take on cholesterol. I definitely recommend that book to so many people, Cholesterol Clarity, because Jimmy Moore does a good job of making it very simple. But cholesterol is something that's still so complex, even for doctors.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's fun to watch being in the nutrition world, the debates between kind of the more low carb community, which is, much more liberal with cholesterol. And there's some very credible commentators on that side of the fence. I mean, we here tend to side a little bit more on the traditional view of things, but you're 100% right. It's incredibly complicated. I mean, you have Dr. David Perlmutter. He's one of the most notable out there who's in favor of this kind of look, it's not necessarily the LDL number. It's, as you pointed out, the particle size, it's the small dense, it's the VLDL, all this stuff. So lipids is a crazy thing that I think is still very much in flux, and people are out there have different perspectives. So it's good to hear yours. But you talked about how you feel. I mean, I'd imagine you'd have to be feeling pretty damn good to wake up one morning and then run 100 miles in one thing. What? Like, I saw that. I was like, dude, I'm waking up here. Like, where I'm at is I'm waking up and I'm like, I'm going to jog a couple miles. I might do some push-ups, maybe a little bit of yoga, walk. And then I'm seeing you and I'm just like, dude, so first of all, I think you did this to support a charity. Mm-hmm. Was that the catalyst behind it?
There was two reasons. One was this organization, Operation Underground Railroad. I'm friends with the founder, Tim Ballard, and he's all over the place now on social media because of what they do. They save children from sex slavery. There's over 2 million children enslaved worldwide that we don't even know about. It's a horrible truth that is truth that exists. If you look into it, it's hard to look away once you realize that this is something that's happened, that still happens in 2020. And it's sickening and it's sad, and they actually do something about it. And that's why people like Tony Robbins and a bunch of celebrities back them up, is because it's one of those things that's pure good versus pure evil, And so I want to do something to help raise money and awareness for them. But then the second thing was I read David Goggins' book, Can't Hurt Me. And I highly recommend that book to anyone out there. Just listen to it on Audible. It'll change your life and your perspective of what you think hard is. So that's where the idea came from of like, you know what? We all have these self-limiting beliefs. And for me, I'm not a runner. I've never been a runner. I've never ran a marathon or a half marathon up until this point. And I was like, you know what? Why not go for 100 miles? Not everyone, but a lot of people do marathons, and it's cool. And that's still an amazing feat, to do, is run a marathon, but very few people go out and run 100 miles. And I was like, you know what? I believe that I can do harder things than I think I can do. And so I'm going to attempt to do it. Now, here's the thing. Last year, I attempted this with about 6 weeks of training, and I only got 80 miles done, which is still an amazing accomplishment.
You only got 80 miles done, bro? Dude, what's wrong?
Only 80.
What was wrong, man?
I know, it's pathetic, right? Just kidding. I was still proud of myself, but I wanted to see if I could actually train properly for it this time, to see if I could do it. So this year I trained for about 6 or 7 months, hardcore, and brought on some professional help with people like Zach Bitter, he's the world record holder for the 100 miler on a track and a treadmill now, which he just broke, and he's a fat adapted athlete. I got to pick his brain and some other good friends of mine, and I had them help me train for this. And this year, I wanted to do it. We had to push it back because of COVID-19. I wasn't able to travel, so I had to do it here in Utah. I was going to go to California to do it. And, it's amazing what your body and mind can accomplish when you really put that effort into it, right? Like I said, I'm not a runner. I'm not naturally gifted. I had to train really hard for this. And yes, I was able to accomplish the 100 miles, and we'll talk about how I did that as a keto athlete. But I wanted to say I could do it. It's not something it's going to become a hobby where I love running now and I want to do it all the time. It just became something that I wanted to say I did, because I wanted to show people that, look, we can do harder things than we think. For someone, it doesn't have to be 100 miles, but it might just be a 5K, like getting out there and doing something that you never have done because you're like, I'm scared. It's out of my comfort zone. Don't know if I could do that. That's going to be hard. I get it. But I want people to prove to themselves that they can do these harder things than they think they can, And like I said, it doesn't have to be 100 miles. It could be whatever. Just find it and do it. And I promise you'll start to, it'll carry over into other aspects of your life. Like, man, what else can I do? So anyways, that's kind of why I decided to do it.
Yeah, I think, and it's inspiring. I mean, it's really inspiring. It was really inspiring to watch you do that on Instagram. And I guess I knew that there was a charity. Hearing the specific charity that was involved just makes it that much better. I mean, what a great cause. We'll have to make sure we link to that in the show notes and do our small part to try to hopefully get, a few people to support. I would like to learn more how to support that organization. It sounds very important. From the athletic standpoint and the ketogenic side, I mean, what are you doing nutritionally to prepare for that level of exertion? Are you just eating, are you eating as you're going? What did you eat the night before? You know, the conventional wisdom is you load up on, you try to pump as much glycogen into your muscles and your liver as possible. And obviously you're not doing that. So what did the fat adapted piece of this look like for you?
Yeah. So for me, the key in this moment for me with the 100 miler was to train my body to become fat adapted. So I would always train in a fasted state. So I train my body to run off of ketones as much as possible. So I would never eat before I do my long runs. I'd always do it in a fasted state. So my body during those 6 months of training became really efficient at using fat as energy during my long runs. And so after talking to people like Zach Bitter, I also talked to a friend of mine who what's his last name? Michael. I talked about him on my podcast. He was on my podcast recently. He ran 100 miles with no food. And he's, I think, the first person to ever do that. And he did it without any food at all, just water. And so I was like, man, okay, maybe I'll take Zach's approach and then take his approach and meet somewhere in the middle. So I went as long as I could without food during my 100-mile race. And the night before, I did eat carbohydrates, clean carbohydrates. I ate, potatoes and sweet potatoes and squash and things like that with my normal meal. Because now that my body's efficient running off ketones, my body still is efficient running off glucose. And my body will know how to use glucose because we've been eating glucose for a long time. But now that transition, when I run out of glucose, is pretty, is pretty smooth and easy because I've trained my body to run in a fat adapted state. So yes, there was some glycogen in the beginning, but obviously you burn through that really quickly. And then from there, it's being efficient at running off of fat as fuel. And so from there, what I did is I went the first 20 miles with no food, just water and electrolytes. And then at mile 20, I started incorporating simple carbohydrates. So here's the thing I learned from this year versus last year too. I didn't bring enough variety of food because last year I was so sick of the texture, the taste of the food that I did bring, which was mostly boiled potatoes and a couple of keto bars and maybe some chips. Nothing tasted good. Nothing sounded good. And so I ran out of anything. I stopped eating in the last 5 hours, and that's why I crashed at mile 80, I think. This year around, I brought all kinds of carbohydrates, all kinds of foods, all kinds of like varieties so that I could, my palate was somewhat, open to eating certain foods. Like I was open to eating certain foods. And so at mile 20, I started incorporating watermelon. I remember eating watermelon, which tasted amazing, but here's the trick. I would also fuel with exogenous ketones. So I would use ketone esters from Ketone Aid during the race. So I would get a bump in ketones and then get a bump in glucose. So my body could use both fuels during my run. And then every hour or so, I would refuel, honestly, with a couple bites of food. This wasn't like I couldn't sit down and eat a whole meal because I would feel so nauseous. I would feel so full from eating so little that I didn't want any digestive issues, running to the bathroom or anything like that, which didn't happen at all. That's the worst thing ever. Yeah. So I would just eat a couple bites of food here and there, whether it was like a peanut butter sandwich, watermelon, banana. Sometimes I would do M&Ms, I would do gummy bears, but also with a sip of the ketones every hour. And honestly, I just was able to maintain that pace throughout the whole 24 hours to where I was able to finish before the 24-hour mark and get it done with no digestive issues. And I ate maybe 1,000 to 2,000 calories max. Wow. But at my Whoop that I was using said I burned 14,000 calories.
Wow.
So I lost a lot of weight during during that run, plus a lot of water weight just because it was so hot here in Utah, and it was summertime, and yeah, I sweat a ton. And so anyways, yeah, I survived. I did it. I'm glad I did it. It's over. I'm taking a break from running for a long, long time.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at now.
What was your darkest moment in that race?
There was two moments. One was during the day. It was like sunny and mid 90s, and there was no shade. And heat exhaustion, heat stroke was something that I could tell was happening because I was getting dizzy during my runs, and I was getting overheated. And my brother actually did the race with me, and he had to drop out at mile 45 because he was getting sick and he was going to pass out. And so he decided to throw in the towel. So the hardest part, darkest, part for me was that moment when he dropped out, and it was the middle of the day, and I didn't know if I was going to be able to overcome the heat. So a couple things happened during that time. Luckily, we had an ice bath, which we brought with us just in case, and we filled it with ice, and I would jump in there every hour when I would go get a break and eat some food. I would jump into the ice bath with my legs.
Yeah.
And I would carry this thing around my neck, this cold towel that would stay cold. And that saved me, honestly, because it helped to cool me down every hour and kept me going. And now the other thing is that the first 20 miles, I was way ahead of pace because had more energy and I was feeling good. I was running fast. But then once the heat exhaustion started to kick in, I had to do a lot of walking because I told myself, look, if I could just survive the hottest part of the day, like noon to 6 p.m., if I could just maintain even a slower pace, but slow it down, then once the night comes, I feel like I could pick up the pace and make up for some of that time, which I totally did. And my average pace was ahead of schedule, going into the night, because even though I slowed down and walked a lot, I just told myself I have to survive the hottest part. And then, once the night comes, then it cools down a little bit, I can pick up the pace a little bit. And luckily that's what happened.
Yeah, kind of like a fighter feeling out those early rounds and wanting to get into the. I've been watching a lot of UFC lately, so I can't help do the UFC analogy. But no, that is awesome, man. It's pretty awe-inspiring. I mean, I think 100 miles is what a marathon is. What, 27 miles?
26.2.
26.2. So it's basically running back to back to back to back four marathons.
Almost 4 marathons
in one day, which is absolutely absolutely insane. We talked about the introduction. I wanted to close out with, you're not only, into fitness and doing training and out there as kind of a thought leader in keto and an advocate for keto, but you're a dad, and you had something that you put up on your Instagram the other day. I'm not a dad. I hope to have kids one day, but I don't have kids, but I do have a lot of friends that have kids, and I love kids. And there's obviously a lot of pressure on kids these days with social media. You said some stuff that I thought was really powerful about body image and daughters and kids. And so I was hoping we could close out the show just by talking about your approach with that and kind of getting that message out there for people.
Yeah, thank you for letting me talk about that, because a lot of people know me as the fit guy, but I'm a dad first and foremost, and I love being a dad. I have 2 daughters. They're 9 and 11 almost, and it's really important for me to help break the cycle of, like we talked about, the pressure that women have in society is more than men do, and women are scrutinized and judged so much more harshly than men do, in my opinion. And it starts from a very young age. And I feel like a lot of daughters learn it from their moms. And luckily, my ex-wife, who I'm still good friends with, she is a body positive type of person. She does not judge her body. She used to back in the day when we were going through a divorce and things like that. But she's done a lot of self-healing and a lot of personal development work with therapists and life coaches. And she's in a place where she loves herself now. She loves her body. But I feel like that message subconsciously gets passed on from one generation to the next through moms and dads to their daughters and their sons. Because if they see their mom or dad picking their body apart, like, oh, I'm so fat, I'm so ugly, I'm so this, I hate my hair, like that is seen by that kid and is passed on to them. Because I remember I just had some lady message me after I posted that post on my social media. She said, thank you for posting this. She said, I remember my mom would always criticize herself, her body, her hair, her looks. And one day someone said, you look just like your mom. And she remembers her mom hating her body, hating herself. And that's where she started to hate herself too, was because someone said to her, "You look like your mom," and she never really saw the beauty inside of her. And I feel like that, like I said, that's something that needs to be broken, and that cycle is something that is passed on. But also, what happens in society is we buy into this myth. We think we're valuable because society judges us based on our bodies, unfortunately. And so we think, well, we want to fit in. I don't want to be made fun of. I don't want to be, teased. So I'm going to do whatever it takes to try and fit in, whether it's more makeup or plastic surgery or dieting all the time, or unhealthy eating habits. We see anorexia and bulimia pretty common in our society, unfortunately. So I feel like, kids will do whatever it takes to fit in. And I wrote that post because it's so important for all parents to understand how to talk to their kids about their bodies. It's not about weight. It's not about looks. It should never be about weight or looks, especially to your kids. It's all about health. It's all about being strong, and setting the example. And here's the thing. If you don't love yourself, you're going to have to learn to fix that if you don't want to subconsciously pass it on to your kids. So if you don't love your body, you have to learn how to heal yourself from that and let go of that. Otherwise, it is passed on. Whether you're as careful about it as possible, but if you really have those self-hate beliefs, I feel like it's going to get passed on. It's going to be noticed at some point. And that's why it's so important for us to heal ourselves first and foremost, so that we can then pour from a full cup instead of an empty cup to our kids and teach them about self-love. So that's kind of where it came from. That was my intention, to really help the moms and dads out there realize that it starts with us. And then from there, here's the do's and do nots when it comes to talking to your kids about their bodies.
Yeah, I saw that and I was like, man, that is so powerful. Just you and I both being in different spheres of the nutrition and kind of health and wellness community, I think the dark underbelly of the health and wellness community can be an almost spiritual autoimmunity, where it's like you're always looking at this event horizon that you need to finally reach, where you can change yourself such that at that point things will be okay. You go on this strict diet, at this point you'll achieve this or this or this. And as much as it does come across a little bit, people could say it's a little bit touchy-feely, whatever, but I think the ability to accept yourself and kind of be part of a health and wellness movement while still accepting who you are is a hugely important message that not a lot of people are out there pushing. And I was really, I just was glad to see you using your platform for that message. So I wanted to highlight that towards the end of the show.
Thanks, man. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, we're really inspired by what you're doing. And I think you're one of the really good, nuanced, empathetic commentators in this world. So we definitely rooting for you and want to see you keep up the good work and want to support you in any way we can. Is there anything that, any final thoughts you want to share? People can find you, Instagram, any closing wisdom you want to throw out there?
Yeah, no, thank you for letting me come on here. And obviously my social media is all fit #2 fit. And, for me, the biggest thing is our perception of health and fitness. And so many times, I'll just say this because it's so true to me, our perception is, the success in our health and fitness journey is to be skinny or be fit. And we think once we get that, once we achieve that, then all of our problems will go away. Then we'll be happy. And so we're chasing after the results. But so many people don't love the process to get those results. And that's why it's short-lived. And that's why some people have a hard time living a healthy lifestyle long-term, is because they only want the results and they're doing the process just to get those results. And the process is hard and it's not easy. If you could shift your perception and learn to fall in love with that process, the process can look differently. It doesn't have to be, 1 hour in the gym and then like 1 hour of cardio and starving yourself and doing this diet or that diet. The process can look differently. But if you could learn to fall in love with the process and operate out of a place of self-love where you're like, you know what, I love myself. I want to feed myself good food because it feels good. And I want to move my body and exercise because it feels good for my body, but also my mind. And then from there, the results end up taking care of themselves over time because you're consistent with the process, because you've learned to fall in love with it. And your focus is on loving yourself and doing the process because you love yourself, instead of, I want the results, so I'll sacrifice and do this process. Even though it sucks, right? It's about shifting your perception of what success looks like in health and fitness. Yeah,
very well said. We appreciate you coming on. Drew, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, John.
Good luck, and we'll be in touch, man.
Thanks, brother. Have a good one.
Yeah. The Gene Food Podcast is our attempt to synthesize the latest developments in the fields of genetics, nutrition, and medicine, and offer you practical tips and stories you can use in your own unique health journey. If you enjoy this podcast, you can find more information online at mygenefood.com.